time, that was the most amazing car.
The meticulous effort that went into bonding everything together and getting it so finite.
You are looking back on a significantly competitive Grand Prix car from the 1992 season that simply was the pace setter, 10 Grand Prix victories from 16 starts, and both World Championships put to bed comfortably before the end of the year.
Nigel was a serious top-level driver.
I had that understanding with the car that if it wasn't just perfect, I could drive around the problem. It was an animal.
The FW14B is an evolution of the 1991 car, the FW14, and the main feature that signifies the B specification is the upgrade to the active ride suspension system for the 1992 season.
Well, the car was good aerodynamically, which was mainly down to Adrian Newey, but it had lots of Williams qualities, so it was basically a good car that was then enhanced by the active ride system.
I believe the active program had started to come on stream. Obviously it raced in '87, but you'd started the program before. Somebody here mentioned there was a bit of inspiration from an ambulance.
I always wanted to do an active suspension. You know, we didn't have the money and the resource, but then some guy showed up who'd worked for an automotive product, and he got this hydraulic self-leveling suspension system that he'd originally designed when he was working at Lucas for ambulances. Basically, we kicked off an active suspension system, and the control system was entirely mechanical on this thing, and we tried to emulate that, but we didn't have any success with that, so we changed it to electronic. It was a three-legged stool system, so whatever you do with the car, you never have corner weights going all over the place. The car could sit on the ground like that, and the corner weight would still be perfect.
It was an R&D project that had got ahead of itself and that they had decided to take to a race. The car was raced at Monza, and it had won the race, and I think at that point Frank Dernie that is, thought, you know, hang on, we ought to have some people to manage this thing.
The thing was, once it started looking like it was going to be good, using subcontractors again, we were thinking, we didn't want that skirt experience again. So I started looking for people who would so we'd actually make our own hardware box. I wanted our own controller, and I wanted someone to write the software.
After he'd interviewed me, he also interviewed Steve Wise. Frank realised he needed engineers.
So I advertised, and those were the two guys that I hired. Paddy's probably the cleverest guy I've ever hired, and Steve was just fantastic on the hardware. And we ended up with a controller which was just fantastic.
You know, having that ability to create reliable wiring harnesses, reliable sensor installations, good solid hydraulic systems that didn't leak, that didn't get contaminated, all the people that surround that to support that who needed that specialist knowledge, which was all new. So we built all of that up, and within that context we applied the active suspension and then a number of other systems like the automatic gearbox, then the traction control, and that all really came together in '92 when we had that sort of perfect assembly of these new weapons.
I also hear you had a go at driving the active.
Well, I was the first person to ever drive the first system, yeah, because nobody else wanted to drive it in case it did what Lotuses kept doing, which was raising their wheels off the ground. And it was in the wet, on slicks. And we turned the boost down as low as it could possibly go, wound the wastegates right open. The clutch seal was leaking, so we could bleed the clutch, and I could then get into first and set off, but after that, no clutch, so I had to change gear without the clutch. So you can imagine how much fun that was.
The biggest problem with the active is when it went wrong, it failed, it could kill you. It would just throw you off the track. and you had no control. One wheel just come up, whatever, and just go bang, straight into the barriers. Very disconcerting, but you know, it was a complete team effort with Riccardo, Damon and Mansell. And it wasn't until we had a fail-safe system where when it failed, it failed everything together. So then it went rock hard, but then you didn't have wheels jumping all over the place. So it felt like you went straight onto concrete. It failed, obviously you couldn't continue, but it didn't then kill you, or try to kill you.
Damon was our driver for the test program.
Yeah.
He was our research and development driver in effect. And we really enjoyed working with Damon. You know, he's a very clever guy as well as a fantastically quick driver. So he was just what we needed on the active project at that stage.
What was it like? Because, you know, they didn't have the telemetry and the data, and it was all down to driver feel, a lot of it at the time, wasn't it?
It was brilliant because there was just lots and lots of toys to play with.
Yeah.
The car could do anything. It was really a platform control, but the ride was controlled to within ridiculous tolerances. And when you look at photographs of the car going around, it looks like the suspension's collapsed. There's no clearance.
I drove the car the first time in Estoril, I think in a winter test, and the grip immediately, I could feel it was more than the passive car. This is because the car was producing more downforce, because of the fact that it was always very level, and it was like to be always in a wind tunnel. In '91, the Active started to be tested, especially with Damon Hill. That was the active test driver. And we had the '91 car that was, I think, the best car I drove in my career. Yes, it was a very predictable car. I got the best feeling really from that car.
You had a lot of pole positions.
Yes, the car was very quick. Unfortunately, we suffered a lot in the first part of the season with the gearbox. We had the automatic gearbox, the first car in Formula One to have this, because the other teams, they were testing the automatic gearbox, but they didn't. They were not able to put in racing.
Right.
But in '91 we could do it. But unfortunately we had a little bit of reliability problem, especially the first 4 races. Then after that it became better, and we started to win Grand Prix and pole position.
It was relentless testing, and if I can't remember, it's because there was so much stuff happening that you just really didn't. By the end of a week's testing, you had no idea what you'd done, because you tried everything from brakes to engines to suspension to aerodynamics, you know, and tyres, of course, and it's just relentless lapping.
We actually were testing in Riccardo fairly late on, and we'd actually already made the decision to race the active system. We noticed on the main straight there that the passive car was actually quicker on end of straight speed by 2 or 3 kilometers an hour. And this was something we hadn't spotted before, even though the lap time was stronger on the active car. And we realized that the passive car was actually stalling itself. The floor was stalling at the end of the straight as it reached a much lower ride height. And because the active car didn't go down to that ride height because it maintained attitude, it wasn't stalling, and the stall was allowing a reduction in the induced drag.
The car was always keeping an attitude nose down and rear up to have the best efficiency for the aerodynamic, for the corners, but this was giving like a parachute effect in the straight. So we had to make a program that the car in the straight, pressing a button, it was changing the attitude, the nose was coming up and the rear was going down, even more than the passive car. So we were losing 4 or 5 kilometers with the old car, compared with the old cars. With this new system, we were gaining 10 kilometers more than the other cars, so it was like a rocket.
Incredible.
So this is where we invented the button, which in a way was the first DRS.
Sure.
And this was the low drag button that the driver would use to literally stall the floor down the straight. And the drivers used it on every straight, if they remembered. And they had to remember to release it before the braking point, which Nigel didn't always remember to do, because He liked to push things harder.
The beginning part of the year when the car was testing before the first race, it was like, what's going to happen?
We invented traction control in late '91, and it literally was one line of software. It was a very, very simple system to implement once we had the right things in place. We introduced it with very little in the form of trials. But we just ran it, and it cut cylinders to reduce the torque. And we ran it for quite a few of the winter tests. But by the time we got to Kyalami for the first race, I think Renault only then were waking up to the point that there would be some reliability risk with this. So during the race, they were saying, you know, you mustn't use it. And actually, Nigel didn't run traction control in Kyalami '92. Riccardo was struggling a bit more for pace. And I think if you go and look at the footage, you'll find that there were occasions when I think it was Ayrton would catch him up, and then he'd switch the traction control on and open the gap up again. And then the Renault guys would come running out to the pit wall and say, tell him to switch off the traction control. So we'd put a board out, or call him on the radio, so he'd switch it off, and then Ayrton would catch up again. And this happened 3 or 4 times in the race, but he used it anyway enough to get the second position.
I mean, what was it like to work on? Because active suspension was so revolutionary that year. We know there's a huge test program with Paddy, Lowe and Damon and stuff, but I mean, were there a lot of all-nighters for you guys?
There was. I think it was the norm in those days, you know, that you did work till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and then come back to the circuit at 6. But actually working on the car, it wasn't difficult. It was just different. There were so many procedures that we never had before that you just had to follow the procedures. And for the first time ever, the electronics people were telling the mechanics what to do. Previously, there was one electronics engineer and you told him when you wanted them to work on the car. Now the roles have been reversed and the electronics people were telling the mechanics what they could do, which went down quite strangely.
But I mean, all the mechanics had these little Xeon computers in it as well, didn't they? In the sort of hand Paddy was telling me to help program the car.
Yeah, there was really like a manual. Paddy and the other guys had written a manual, and so the mechanics had to go through training to use these Xeons that they'd never used before. To do anything on the car, you'd do something and then plug the Xeon in and make sure that was at the correct reading. You know, just pull the gearbox on and off. There was a Xeon plugged in just to make sure the clutch row was correct.
And let's give people some perspective. I mean, how many people were you on the team compared to what they've got now?
Oh, probably, I think somewhere around 25 people.
Yeah, and today there's more than double of that travel
I think there's more like 80, 90 people.
And Nigel, what was he like? Because obviously he dominated the season, winning.
Nigel had total faith in the car. A lot of people forget that Nigel did all the active ride work at Lotus, all the development at Lotus. So when this car came in, he knew what to expect, whereas Riccardo, it was new for him. You know, suddenly he'd lost the feel of springs and dampers, and there was a hydraulic system there propping the car up. And it does feel totally different, so they tell me.
Nigel was a serious top-level driver, and I don't think we quite realised that when we took him on in 1985, but it did become very clear quite soon that that was the case, and he won 29 of his 31 Grand Prix at Williams, so quite significant success.
Hey, Nigel was on fire that year. I said before that a number of things had come together in terms of systems on the car, which altogether about maybe 2.5 seconds a lap of new technology we put on that car from the year before. But this was Nigel's year. And there was something about the car that really suited Nigel's style. Nigel is a very, very brave driver, probably the bravest driver I worked with. And that suited the car, because the car was a car that rewarded huge faith, I would say. very typical would be a corner like Copse at Silverstone, where it could, in theory, almost be flat, but you would have to have the confidence that that was possible. And the trouble with that car was the more you lifted, the more you lost downforce and the slower you went. Conversely, the more you could stay in the throttle, the more downforce you had, and the quicker you could go around the corner. And as an example, in Silverstone that year, Nigel went 25 kilometres an hour quicker through Copse than he had ever done in the build-up in practice on that pole lap, and 40 kilometres an hour quicker than Riccardo through that same corner.
Riccardo was very fast, faster I would say in the passive FW14 than he was relative to Nigel in the 14B. I don't think the active ride car gave him the feedback that he was looking for, but he was a real gentleman and a pleasure to have in the team.
What were your feelings ahead of the Grand Prix?
I'm glad you asked that, because that was a really, really special weekend in my whole Formula One career, because this was the launch of this car, the first race, and been 5 or 6 year build up to that. The emotions were incredible, because on the one point we first met McLaren at this event. So they had chosen not to do any common track tests with anyone else. They'd gone private testing all winter. So nobody knew how quick they were. As it turned out, that was more their loss than ours. So when we went out in the first practice, you know, we were massively quicker than them, and I thought, well, you know, they're just sandbagging this, or there's some issue. And as the weekend developed, session by session, and we were always quicker, just this gradual realization came that actually, you know, here we are quicker than McLaren. And it's difficult to describe that fully. Imagine McLaren have won 88, 15 out of 16, 89, 90, 91, a little bit more of a struggle, but they were such a difficult team to ever imagine you could beat in those days. And here we were with a car that was hugely quicker than theirs, but you only gained the confidence in that fact as the days went by through that race weekend. Yeah. So that was an incredible feeling of reward. And then it came to the race, and I remember standing on the grid and actually feeling physically sick, just because I knew all the things that could go wrong. And here was the moment. You know, it's one thing to go and do thousands and thousands of kilometres around a test track, but for an actual race where, you know, it's going to be on TV, the driver expects, the team expects, everyone expects, and I knew all the pitfalls. So we were celebrating our 1-2 in the garage, and I got a tap on the shoulder. You're wanted in Parc Fermé. That was my first meeting with Charlie Whiting. I'd never come across Charlie until that day. Bear in mind, you know, we're a lot more familiar with the rules and all the processes now than was the case back then. It was really so much simpler, I would say. So I went down to Parc Fermé, and there was a problem with the cars, that they were sitting nose up, right, with effectively at minimum ride height on the rear and maximum on the front. And the reason for this was that the cars had been wheeled from one end of the pit lane to the other. The drivers had stopped at the podium end, and then the Parc Fermé was the other end, and they'd wheeled them all the way down. Now, when the car was stopped, we had a valve that sealed all the oil in the system so that the car didn't collapse onto the ground. But it was only one valve, and there was a way that if you disturbed the car with small bumps as you'd get wheeling it along, gradually the oil would shuffle from the rear into the front, and the car would move itself to pitch up. And the problem now was, in those days, the car was measured to the ground, not on, we have what we call the table of doom now. All measurements, all dimensional measurements are made to the reference plane on a frame, so this problem wouldn't occur nowadays. In those days it was measured to the physical ground, and the problem was the rear wing, the box had the rear wing, top rear edge had gone out of the box because of this. So I had to say to Charlie, look Charlie, it will all be fine if I can start the engine and get it all powered up in the right condition again. And when it started, I have to move this switch from here to here, which would enable the suspension. And of course that seemed really dodgy as a request, a switch to put it back in a legal state. But fortunately Charlie was very understanding. This is not a well-known fact, but the 14B was 20-25 kilos overweight all year.
I was lucky enough in 1992 to attend several races that in hindsight were quite key moments. I was there in Monaco. The atmosphere in those last 6 or 7 laps when people initially realised what was building. Mansell recovering after an unplanned pit stop, chasing down Senna, and then the 3 or 4 laps to the checkered flag where they were literally nose to tail. That was a pretty pivotal moment of excitement for 1992, but sadly, despite being dominant, we were on the losing end that day, something quite rare for Williams that season.
But I can remember watching Nigel winning races and feeling an enormous sense of pride that I'd worked on that car with him, and there he was cleaning up and winning lots of races, and I knew everything about the team and what was going on with the car. And so this, seeing the success of those cars, you're getting that sense of being part of a team. But I didn't have the onerous, really kind of stressful job of having designed the car and having that pressure. We forget, don't we, how difficult it is for them to send out, they're asked, is it going to be all right? And they go, they've done their maths and they've done their software and they're going, yeah, it's going to be fine. But deep down, they're probably thinking, I hope it's right.
Nothing was going to beat him that year. The way he worked with the car and the confidence he had. I don't know if you've ever seen Nigel's steering wheel. He just drives with a wheel, about 2/3 the diameter of anyone else. And there was no power steering in those days. And Nigel's neck would run from here straight, he was not particularly fit. Drivers were not fit in those days. They didn't train like they do now. But he was immensely strong, as strong as an ox. And he liked the small wheel because he could turn it quickly, even though it took a lot of force. And that allowed him to make huge corrections and get the car out of any trouble. And again, that was a great combination with this car.
Riccardo, we spoke to him at Goodwood as well, said he didn't have the same trust in the active car as you did. You
had to have a relationship with the car that you could trust it. And you probably know the story about Riccardo being incredibly unhappy, saying that he got a really bad car and I got a good car. Both Sir Patrick and Sir Frank were brilliant in Sao Paulo. I think it was the second race. And I persuaded them in second qualifying to swap cars with Riccardo, because I wanted him to see that there was nothing in the cars. And if there was, I wanted to highlight for him that there was something wrong with his car. So on my first flying lap at Sao Paulo in the second qualifying, in his car, I was 1.5 seconds quicker. It's trust and commitment. I mean, the problem is you have to drive through a problem with the active car. It's like when you got understeer. First thing you do with understeer, the first feeling you want to do with understeer is come off the throttle to get the front grip again to turn in. However, if you're able to drive through the understeer, you'll get oversteer, because then the back end will kick out. I had that commitment. I had that understanding with the car that if it wasn't just perfect, I could drive around the problem. I didn't have a problem with it because I had the brute strength of carrying the car. But I mean, yeah, it was an animal. I've never had so many elation feelings and disappointments.
The best year was '92 because we finished first and second in the championship. It was a dreaming car.
To you, was it the perfect car?
Renault did an absolutely superb job with the engine. The gearbox and the reliability of the gearbox, the mechanics, the engineering, the the makers of the front wings, the rear wings, it's just phenomenal.
You cannot stop the progress of great engineering, and Formula One is really a crucible of great engineering, and so it's proved to be. We've developed from then on, but I see the 14B as really, you know, a turning point, the first introduction of that new era of complex Formula One cars.